Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Italy on the first foreign trip of his third term to attend the G7 summit. Under Prime Minister Modi, India has been a regular invitee to the G7 meets in the past few years. It was a mega day of bilaterals on the sidelines of the G7 summit. Prime Minister Modi held bilaterals with France's Macron and UK's Rishi Sunak, and also had one-on-one with Ukraine's Zelensky. Later, he was welcomed at the summit venue by Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and even had a meeting with the Pope, who was present at the venue. The leaders who are present in Italy at present includes United States President Joe Biden, Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, Canada's head of state, also France, Germany, Japan. This is being seen as a historic G7, particularly where there is a discussion which is being held on artificial intelligence. And on agenda is also comprehensive strategic partnership, enhancing industrial cooperation in the defense sector, nuclear, space, boosting trade and climate action. And Prime Minister, in fact, has called for giving priority to the concerns of the global South. And not really a surprise that there is no meeting scheduled between Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Prime Minister Modi at present. Now let's try to understand why India's presence at G7 summit is so crucial. After the G20 summit in Delhi last year, India is trying to emerge as the voice of the global South, a position which has gained significance amidst debates on climate change. India stands to gain majorly from G7 countries trying to shift their economic ties away from China to friendly countries. West is also trying to contain China economically. And Ukraine was in focus on day one of the G7. In fact, G7 has agreed for a $50 billion loan for Ukraine from frozen Russian assets to help fight the invading Russian forces. US had pushed for Ukraine aid and a united front against China's trade practices at G7 finance meeting. Let me bring in the guests who are joining us. Michael Kugelman is joining me from Washington, D.C. He is the director of South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. We have Prabhu Dayal, a former diplomat, and Brahma Chelani, strategic affairs expert. Michael, beginning with you, the expectations from this G7, particularly after the bar or the discourse which has been set by India in the G20.
This is a very important summit, and I think it's important that India be there. I mean, if you look at this as something that's meant to bring together some of the world's top economies, India, of course, is not a member of the G7, but it is the world's fastest growing major economy, the fifth largest economy in the world now, and clearly a consequential global player. So I think it's important that that the Indian Prime Minister be there. And indeed, if you look at the key issues on the table, there's so many of them. You're talking about China, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about AI, we're talking about the various wars happening in the world. India, for different reasons, has important things to say in all of these stories. And indeed, I would absolutely agree with your point. The fact that we've seen over the last few years India working to project itself as a bridge between the developed countries and the global South, something that it began doing as the G20 chair. I mean, you look at the issues that are going to be discussed at this G7 summit. So many of them are issues that impact the global South disproportionately, whether you're talking about climate change or debt or what have you. So I think this is a great opportunity for Prime Minister Modi, newly in his third term now, to engage with some of the key developed countries in the world on these critical issues that are of such import for the global South, and to try to use that, to leverage that, to pursue these broader goals of serving as that advocate and champion for the global South. It won't be easy, for sure, but I think this is a good start, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. The G7 meet, Ambassador Dayal, which was held in Hiroshima, I had the opportunity to cover that summit. There was a lot of anticipation and also a lot of curiosity around the India story. After that, there was G20 held in New Delhi, and India managed to send that message that it is the voice of the global South. So do you think that transition from G7 in Hiroshima to now G7 in Italy, the role of India becomes important because of what India managed to achieve in the G20 summit in New Delhi?
Well, you're right. The G7 countries have begun to recognize the increasing importance of India in the global system. For India, attending the G7 summit is also very important because it gives us an opportunity to project the interests of the global south. And we want that global challenges should be addressed and that international cooperation should be fostered for a brighter future for everybody. Now, let me mention that for the G7, the engagement with India is important for several reasons. Let me mention two of the most important reasons. Firstly, the G7 comprises the biggest economies of the world, which are democracies. Now, without doubt, India is the world's largest democracy, and India now is the world's fifth largest economy. India's economy is larger than that of four of the G7 members: UK, France, Italy, and Canada. So, India deserves a place in constant interaction with the G7. In fact, there have been certain voices which have argued in favor of the G7 again becoming the G8, and this time with the inclusion of India. The
And the
second
fact,
factor, which is
yes, Ambassador Dayal, I'm coming back to you. Brahmachalani, the fact is that there is another grouping in Quad. And increasingly, all these groups are realizing the role that India is playing. And how there has been reimagining of the foreign policy in the last 10 years of Prime Minister Modi as he begins his third term. The fact then here is that how long will we keep on saying that India deserves that place, be it at United Nations, we have been talking about it, or in G7, but who will really take that move? Who will make that move? Because with regards to G20, India as the host country took that step of including the African countries.
You raise a good question. First, we need to keep in mind that the G20 has replaced the G7 as the world's premier economic forum. The G7 has been in decline, largely because its member states' share of the global GDP has diminished. So as the economic strength declines, the global influence also declines, and the relevance of the G7 itself is being questioned in the West. The G7 is very different from G20. The G7 member states are tied together by security treaties. They're allies of the United States. So it's a very different kind of arrangement. It's a Western bloc. The G20 is so different. As far as India is concerned, the reason why India was invited to the G7 summit is largely because to make the G7 more relevant in the present circumstances, in a nod to the changing balance of power in the world, Italian Prime Minister Meloni invited the leaders of India, Brazil, UAE, and Turkey. She also invited Zelensky and the man who's been advocating a ceasefire in the Ukraine war for a long time. That's the Pope. The Pope wants a ceasefire. Zelensky wants the war to continue. So she had both sides present at the G7 summit. But the importance of having prominent non-Western leaders present at the G7 summit underscores the fact that the relevance of the G7 by itself is not only in decline, but the relevance of the G7 only requires the presence of other actors that are important in international affairs today. But I think the most important thing for non-Western leaders who are present there, as well as for the Western leaders who are part of the G7, is that a G7 summit offers an excellent opportunity to hold a series of bilateral discussions, or bilateral meetings with other leaders on the sidelines. So it's a very rich opportunity where in a couple of days you can have a series of very important meetings with world leaders. That's the reason why non-Western leaders were, all of them accepted
So
the invitation
basically,
from
Brahmachalani,
Meloni.
the point here is that G7 right now isn't really reflective of global aspirations, Michael.
Yes, and I agree with Brahmachalani on that. And you could have the same discussion when it comes to prospects for reform at the UN Security Council, right? When we talk about expanding that, obviously very difficult to get to that point, a lot difficult to make changes there compared to inviting more people to attend more countries to attend the G7. But yes, the world is a whole lot different than it was when these prestigious clubs were first formed, and I think it's great to have not just India, but a number of these outreach countries, some of the really major states from the global south and the developing world, from the Middle East and Latin America. I think this is very important. And as we were discussing before, if you look at the big issues on the table, many of the big issues on the table, these are issues that so disproportionately affect the non-richest countries, the global south, and climate change is obviously the biggest example. So I think that this is the time to try to think about how to make the G7 more relevant and a great start.
Climate change, but you don't have the developing nations. Then how will you get their perspective in understanding their challenges? G7 nations cannot be sitting in judgment of the requirements of developing economies, Brahmachalani. But my question, Brahmachalani, who will take that step? Will it be the host country to say that their time has come to increase G7 to G8 or perhaps G10? This has been discussed for the last 7-8 years, but no movement has happened. India took that step in ensuring that, the African Union becomes part of G20.
Well, the fact that African Union was brought into the G20 made the G20 more relevant.
Yes.
Now it's a G21 effectively, right? So that's where this decisions on issues like climate change, on global economic issues can be made, and that's exactly the right kind of platform to take such big decisions. But it's also interesting to note that not only is the G7's relevance in decline, most of the G7 leaders who are attending this summit in Italy face waning support at home. Sunak is likely to be gone in 3 weeks once British elections are over. Macron's future will be decided in the upcoming parliamentary elections from June 30th. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz leads an increasingly unpopular government. Trudeau, after 8 years in power, has become increasingly controversial and is unlikely to win re-election. Japan's Kishida could be replaced in autumn. And Biden, going by present projections, stares at possible defeat in November. So among the present G7 leaders, only Italy's Meloni will likely be still in office when the next G7 summit is held. So when Modi goes to next year's G7 summit, he'll be facing new faces. And that really shows how the West today is at a crossroads. We have seen in the European Parliament elections in Europe,
yes,
the rightward shift, the shift towards the right that's happening in Europe, other than in Britain, where the Labour Party is expected to return to office. We're seeing also a rightward shift in domestic politics, possibly in the US and possibly in Canada. So the West today is clearly at a crossroads at a time when the West's clout in world affairs is also
and if we were to make a comparative study and comparative perspective, just to sum up this conversation, India stands as the lone exception, in fact, across major democracies in delivering a clear mandate to the incumbent leader. Or coalitions since COVID-19. In fact, the huge list from Indonesia to Brazil to Philippines, Germany. 30 seconds to you, Prabhu Dayal.
Well, I was only trying to point out why the G7 countries consider India so important that they want to have a continuous engagement with it. And this is shown by the 5th consecutive participation of Prime Minister Modi in the G7 summit. Now, one, of course, I said is the size of India's economy. Another one is the fact that the focus of the G7 countries is slowly shifting to the Indo-Pacific. And European countries in particular are keen to benefit from the economic opportunities which that region offers. Of course, there is the belligerent China, which is facing everybody and preventing anyone from making any inroads because of its expansionist policies. But India has emerged as a major strategic partner to contain China.
Okay.
And this fact is something that naturally interests the G7 countries. China is without doubt the elephant in the room. There has been a lot of discussion relating to China
All
in the
right.
G7 from the
Thank
earlier
you
summit.
so much. Of course, this conversation will be continuing because even as we speak, that meeting has begun in Italy. Michael Kugelman, Prabhu Dayal and Brahmachalani, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And we are putting this entire discussion on NDTV.com.